word Shabbat appears more in the Brit Hadashah, the renewed covenant, than it does in the entirety of the Tanakh. It appears over 137 times, and in every example, it is mentioned in a positive and honorable Kodesh way, because Yahushua, the Mashiach, he taught that we should honor the Shabbat. We will see that Yahushua would go to the local congregations of the Shabbat, and he would open the scrolls of the Torah and the prophets, and he would confirm the covenant to the people by teaching them the Dabar Yahuwah, the word of Yahuwah, and by healing their sicknesses on the Shabbat to make it Kodesh, to make it special, set apart and pure. And he did this because he learned this from his father, his Abba Yahuwah. Yahuwah was the first to keep the Shabbat. We read this in Bereshith chapter 2. It said, Waya Shabbat, and he Shabbat, or and he rested. Yahushua, being the Ben Yahuwah, the son of Yahuwah, would also keep the Shabbat, and he would teach his taught ones, his Talmudim, to observe the Shabbat. And never will you see where he broke the Shabbat in the entirety of the Brit Hadashah, or that his taught ones would break the Shabbat. But rather, they always made it honorable. They always made it a memorial. We're going to look at Mark chapter 6. In verse 2, it says, And Shabbat having come, he began to teach in the congregation, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, Where did he get all of this? And what wisdom or chokmah is this which he has given to him, that such miracles are done through his hands? They are marveling on the Shabbat because Yahushua does many of his signs on the Shabbat, and he teaches in the congregation on the Shabbat. If we look at Luke chapter 4, verse 16, it says, And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and according to his practice, the King James Version says custom, his practice or his custom, he went into the congregation on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. So it is Yahushua's custom. We're not going to look at every single example of him standing up to read and him teaching from the Torah scrolls on the Shabbat. Because again, remember, there is over 137 examples of the Shabbat in the Brit Hadashah. But it is important to highlight a few just so you get the idea that Yahushua makes the Shabbat special by teaching the people from the Torah and the prophets on the Shabbat. Further down in Luke chapter 4, in verse 31, it says, And he came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbaths. In Luke, if we go over Lucas chapter 6, verse 1, and we're going to read about a controversial situation where Yahushua was indeed keeping and honoring the Shabbat, but it was suggested by the Pharisees that he was breaking it. Let's look at it in verse 1. It says, And it came to be on a Shabbat that he went through the grain fields, and his taught ones were plucking the heads of grain and were eating, rubbing them with their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, Why are you doing what is not right to do on the Shabbat? Now, before we go on further, let me highlight, obviously, what he thinks is being done that is breaking the Shabbat. He sees them plucking the grain and they're eating it, and he believes that this should not be done on the Shabbat. Because we are supposed to gather our food, right, at other times. However, they are not gathering food. Okay? They're not gathering like the man that was gathering sticks, but rather they're just walking through the grain fields, and they're reaching out, and whatever they are picking and rubbing through their hands, they're eating instantly. They're not gathering food. They're not working or practicing malacha, which is work or business. What they are doing is they are feeding themselves, and that is perfectly legitimate on the Shabbat. Listen to Yahushua's response in verse 3. And it says, Yahushua answering them said, Have you not read what Dawid, who has been called David, did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of Elohim and took and ate the showbread, and also gave some of those with him, which is not right for anyone but the Kohanim, the priests, to eat. But he said to them, the son of Adam, the Ben Adam, is master or adon of the Shabbat. This is one of the most bold proclamations that Yahushua makes. He says that he is master of the Shabbat. Now this has been misunderstood in Western society, where they believe that this means that because he's the master, he has dominion over it and no longer keeps it. You see, no, rather, Yahushua is saying that he is the master of the Shabbat, that he observes the Shabbat in the perfect way and pleases the Father as the master of keeping the Shabbat, the Ben Adam, the son of Adam. And it says in verse 6, and it also came to be on another Shabbat that he entered into the congregation and taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely, whether he would heal on the Shabbat, for them to find an accusation against him. And he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had the withered hand, rise and stand in the midst. And he rose up and stood. And Yahushua said to them, I ask you, is it right to do tov, or what is called, people say good, on the Shabbat, or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? And looking around at them, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored, sound as the other. But they were filled with folly, and were speaking with one another what they should do to Yahushua. This is amazing. They saw a man's hand restored on the Shabbat, and they want to accuse him. They want to persecute him, which should be noted that Yahushua, we're going to see, was persecuted for honoring the Shabbat in this way. Now, why would they think that this was work? This was not work. Yahuwah Elohim had done the healing. He had done it through his son Yahushua. No man could possibly do a healing, restoring life to another, without the power and mighty right hand of the I am that I am, the self-existing Yahuwah Elohim. It was Yahuwah who had done this awesome sign. And if you think about it, the Shabbat is about restoration. The Shabbat is about rest. And Yahushua was given this man the ability to have restoration. In essence, Yahushua was giving the gift of Shabbat to this man by allowing him to feel the fullness of restoration and rejuvenation, and that is what Shabbat is all about. Remember, Yahushua said he is the master of the Shabbat. In Luke chapter 13, if we go to verse 10, Luke chapter 13, and in verse 10, it reads, and he was teaching in one of the congregations on the Shabbat. And see, there was a woman having a weakened ruach, or spirit, for 18 years, and was bent over and was unable to straighten up at all. And Yahushua, seeing her, called her near and said to her, woman, you are loosened from your weakness. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was straightened up and praised Elohim. But the ruler of the congregation responded, and he was much displeased that Yahushua had healed on the Shabbat, and said to the crowd, there are 6 days on which men should work, and come and be healed on them, not on the Shabbat day. Then the master answered him and said, hypocrite! Does not each one of you on the Shabbat loosen his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead it away to water? And this one, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Shaitan has bound, look, for 18 years, should she not be loosened from the bond on the Shabbat? And when he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the crowd rejoiced over all the splendid works being done by him. Listen to the response there. Yahushua, with this amazing response, says, how much more is this woman than an animal? You lead your own animals. to drink water on the Shabbat. And this woman has been bound for 18 years. She has carried this heavy burden, not for 6 days, like we work for 6 days. No, not even for 6 years, for 18 years. And Yahushua chooses the Shabbat to set her free, so that she can truly enjoy resting, so that she can truly enjoy the Shabbat from the master of the Shabbat himself. And Yahushua gives again to this woman the gift of Shabbat by healing her on the Shabbat. If we go to Luke chapter 14, over one chapter, read in verse 1. It says, "And it came to be, as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Shabbat, that they were watching him closely. And see, there was a certain man before him suffering from dropsy. And Yahushua responding spoke to those learned in the Torah and the Pharisees, saying, Is it right to heal on the Shabbat? But they were silent. So taking hold of him, he healed him and let him go. And to them he said, Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, shall not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they were unable to answer him regarding these matters." Here Yahushua sees this man. He's struggling and he's having a hard time. He can't stand up. He has the dropsy. And Yahushua sees that he is weak and he is struggling under this burden. And it is right for a man to be loosened from his burdens on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat. And because he was from on high, because he was from Yahuwah Elohim himself, he knew the very essence and heart of the Sabbath. But those who were supposed to be teachers among him did not understand the essence of Shabbat. They did not understand that it was better to save and preserve life and to give life and to loosen those who were bound on the Shabbat, so that they could truly rejoice in Yahuwah their Elohim and enjoy their Shabbat, just like everybody else. In Yahuchanan, chapter 5, verse 8, it says, Yahushua said to him, Rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man became well and took up his bed and was walking. Now it was the Shabbat on that day. The Yahudim therefore said to him who had been healed, It is a Shabbat. It is not right for you to take up the bed. He answered them, He who made me well said to me, Take up your bed and walk. They did not understand this man had never walked. He was lame, and he had this bed that he'd been laying on for years and years and years. And Yahushua said for him to take up the bed and to walk. He was to take up the bed to show the work and the power of Yahuwah Elohim in his life. He was not doing work. He was not conducting business. He was not doing heavy labor. When we're talking about a bed, people think of, the modern comforters and the modern mattresses. No, we're talking about basically is just a roll-up mat is what these people would have used back then. We're not talking about some heavy burden. It's about probably as heavy as my scriptures. And does that mean that now I shouldn't carry my scriptures on the Sabbath? That would be ridiculous. Have you seen the Torah scrolls? They're enormous. They're huge. They're heavy, but yet they are carried on the Sabbath day in a great progression of rejoicing on the Sabbath. It's very important to see that Yahushua was not breaking the Sabbath. He was giving life and touching hearts and lives and healing on the Shabbat, not through his power, but through the power of Yahuwah, his Father. If we go on down to verse 15 in Yahuchanan chapter 5, in the same situation we read, it says, The man went away and told the Yahudim that it was Yahushua who made him well. And because of this, the Yahudim persecuted Yahushua. and were seeking to kill him because he was doing these healings on the Shabbat. You have to catch this. They are now persecuting Yahushua for keeping the Sabbath, for keeping the Shabbat. Yet many people today who say that they know the Master Yahushua and that they follow his ways say that we don't have to keep the Sabbath. We don't have to keep the Shabbat. But Yahushua was persecuted for giving life and giving great signs and making the Shabbat Kodesh through the restoration. And it says in verse 17, but Yahushua answered them, my Father works until now, and I work. Because of this then, the Yahudim were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Shabbat, but he also called Elohim his own Father, making himself equal with Elohim. In chapter 9 of YaHuWaH, in verse 14, it says, now it was a Shabbat when Yahushua made the clay and opened his eyes. Now this is talking about a blind man whose eyes were open. Yahushua spit into the clay, made a little bit of mud and applied it to the man's eyes, and this gave sight to the man. Now why did Yahushua do this on the Sabbath? Why would he choose to do this? We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Just bear with me. Let's read in verse 15. It says, therefore the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I wash and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from Elohim, because he does not guard the Shabbat. Others said, how is a man who is a sinner able to do such miracles? And there was a great division among them. Now what was the division about? You have to understand, these are Pharisees who are trained in Torah, and they are now dividing because of this man who was healed. His eyes were open. And what they're dividing over is the method in which Yahushua did the healing. Because you see, in the Mishnah, the Talmud, the oral traditions, not the Torah now, not the laws and the commandments of Yahuwah, but the oral traditions of men of the Yahudim, who are called the Jews, their traditions say that it is not right to apply salava to the eyes on the Shabbat day. Because you see, salava was a lubricant used for those who were blind. When you are blind, you're not aware of how long your eyes are open. They will get very dry. And there's only a few things you can use for eyes. Eyes are very delicate. Rose water, saliva, things like that were used. So they had ruled that because they saw this as work, because they were providing a service for the blind, that this should not be done. And also there was a ruling that you should not ever make up clay on the Shabbat. This is found in the oral traditions, not in the Torah. Yahushua wasn't making up bricks. He wasn't mixing concrete. He just spit on a little bit of clay and applied it just enough for the man's eyes. And yet there is a great controversy here. Now there is a division among the Pharisees. They're dividing because of him. Some are saying, he doesn't guard the Shabbat. Look what he did on the Shabbat. And others are saying, well, wait a minute. These are oral traditions. That doesn't mean that this man is a sinner. How can a man who's a sinner do such a great sign and a miracle? This is amazing. And we'll see, if you look in the book of Acts, that thousands upon thousands of Pharisees actually came to belief in Yahushua. Many of the Pharisees came to belief in Yahushua. Oftentimes, you see the Pharisees and they're asking him questions, and you see men like Nicodemus, who is called Nicodemus, who is a Pharisee. Joseph of Ramathiah, who is called Joseph, he was also a Pharisee. These were followers of Yahushua. Shaul, the man who is called Paul, was a Pharisee. Okay, it's important to know these things. So they understood that these were traditions, that he didn't truly break the Sabbath. In YaHuWaH, chapter 19, verse 31, we're going to read briefly about Yahushua's death. It says, therefore, since it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the stake on the Shabbat, for that Shabbat was a high one. In Aramaic, it says, Rabba Yom HaShabbat, chief Yom of the Sabbath, the chief day of the Sabbath. This is an idiomatic expression for a festival Sabbath, because Yahushua was nailed to the stake on the preparation day of the Passover. At the very time that the Passover lambs were beginning to be slaughtered, Yahushua was nailed to the stake. And at the time when the last of the Passover lambs would be slaughtered, he gave up his spirit, his ruach. He fulfilled the Passover. We're going to talk about that in the video on the Pesach, on the Passover. However, for now, we want to observe the fact that it says that this Shabbat was a high one. It says the Yahudim asked Pilate to have their legs broken, that they be taken away. Now, when they came to Yahushua, Yahushua was already dead. So they did not break his legs because, again, no bone should be broken in the Passover lamb. But what is beautiful here is Yahushua fulfills the Passover by dying as the Passover lamb on the Passover. And now, on the chief day of the Sabbath, which is the first day of unleavened bread of matzah, Yahushua will be resting his body because he is dead. And he'll be laid into the tomb and removed just as leaven is removed during this time period. So not only did Yahushua come to fulfill the weekly Sabbath, which we were about to see, but he came to fulfill the festival Sabbaths as well. In Luke chapter 23, verse 55, it says, "And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after and saw the tomb, how his body was laid. And having returned, they prepared spices and perfumes, and they rested on the Shabbat according to the command." You see, in Western Christianity, their ideology teaches that when Yahushua died, the Torah itself was now annulled. It was not to be observed any longer, and neither was the Shabbat. But Yahushua's followers are still keeping the Shabbat. He's dead, and they're still observing the Shabbat. And now we're going to see that in his resurrection, he truly resurrected on the weekly Sabbath. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, it says, "Now after the Shabbat," and in most versions it says, "toward the dawning of the first day of the week." Now this is an inaccurate translation. But first, let's just read it the way it says. It says, "Now after the Shabbat, toward the dawning of the first day of the week, Miriam from Magdala and the other Miriam came to see the tomb." So we know that when they got to the tomb, that they did not find the master, that he was already gone. If the translation was correct and the Shabbat had just ended, and now the first day of the week is coming to fruition, and they are getting to the tomb just as the first day of the week is beginning, and he's already gone, then what day of the week did he raise? Because he's already gone. He had to raise on the weekly Sabbath. It's the only way that this can work. But I have to point out that, again, the first day of the week is actually not what it says in the Greek or in the Aramaic. In the Greek, it says miaton sabbaton, which means one of Sabbaths. In Aramaic, it says chad Shabbat. These are both idiomatic expressions that refer to the day of first fruits, the first day of the counting of the Omer, when we count 7 completed Sabbaths, and the day after, the morrow after, will give us 50. That is why the Greeks call this festival Pentecost, because we have the festival of Shavuot, or weeks, on the 50th day. It's very important to know this because this has stumped Western Christianity. They do not know this. They have no clue of this or concept of this because they are so far removed from the Torah. There are many brothers and sisters out there who do not know this. They still think that these events happened on the first day of the week. But no, it's so much more than that. He rose on the day of the first fruits. And the scriptures call him the first fruits. It was on this day that the high priest would bring the barley into the house of Yahuwah and wave the sheaf offering before Yahuwah Elohim as the first fruits offering. And it was this day that Yahushua conquered death and rose to Yahuwah and presented himself as the priest of Yahuwah, as the Kohen of Yahuwah. And he presented himself as the first fruits offering, fulfilling not just the weekly Sabbath, but also the first of the counting of Sabbaths, which is the beginning of the count towards the festival of Shabbat, or weeks. Now, if you look at John Yahuchanan chapter 20 verse 1, you will see this very same example echoed. And if you go and examine the Aramaic and the Greek, you will see that the same remains true, that it is Miaton Sabbaton and Chad Shabbat. The same for Mark chapter 16 verse 9 and Luke chapter 24 verse 1. Never do you see any of Yahushua's taught ones keeping the first day of the week, ever. As a matter of fact, every single place where it says that, like, Shaul was teaching on the first day of the week, every time you read that in the Greek, it says Miaton Sabbaton, on one of the Sabbaths, or Chad Shabbat, the Sabbath day. Okay? All the time you will see these examples. You will never see, ever, Protos Hamera, which is literally first day. Never. Only in this verse will you see this phrase. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 4. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy for your fellowship in the Tob news, or the glad tidings, the Bashar. From the first day, Protos Hamera, until now. And never will you see this phrase anywhere else. Because everywhere in your translation, if it says first day of the week outside of this verse, it is an inaccurate translation. In Acts chapter 13, verse 13, now we have to remember this is after the death, resurrection, and ascension. In Acts 13, verse 13, it reads, and having put out from Paphos Shaul, who the Christians call Paul, and those with him came to Perge in Pamphylia. And Yahuchanan, who's been called John, having left them, returned to Jerusalem. But passing through from Perge, they came to Antioch and Pisidia, and went into the congregation on the Shabbat day and sat down. If we go on further onto verse 26 in this chapter, it says, men, brothers, this is Shaul speaking. Men, brothers, sons of the race of Abraham, and those among you fearing Elohim, to you the word of the deliverance has been sent, for those dwelling in Jerusalem, and their rulers, because they did not know him, nor even the voices of the prophets which are read every Shabbat. They have filled them in having judged him. And verse 42, it says, and when the Yahudim went out of the congregations, the Gentiles, the nations, begged to have these words spoken to them on the next Shabbat. Now, why is this important? Because these men are Gentiles who are observing the Sabbath, and they are receiving the Debar Yahuwah, the word of Yahuwah, into their life by the preaching of Shaul, who is promoting the Sabbath and promoting the glad tidings of Yahushua, our Messiah, on the Sabbath. And these Gentiles, these Goyim, those from the other nations who were there, want to hear. It says they beg to have these words spoken to them the next Sabbath, meaning that they're going to keep the Sabbath next week as well, because they were already observing Shabbat. And when the meeting of the congregation had broken up, many of the Yahudim and of the worshiping converts followed Shaul and Barnabas, who's called Barnabas, who speaking to them were urging them to continue in the favor of Elohim. And on the next Shabbat, almost all the city came together to hear the Dabar Elohim, the word of Elohim. Now, this is very different from the people who claim Shaul today, who say that they follow this man, they call him Paul. And they say that, they believe his words and his letters and all these things, but when we look at Shaul's life, he kept the Shabbat. He, by his own admission, had been a Pharisee. He is from the tribe of Benjamin, of the 12 tribes of Yasharel. That he says by his own admission, he is a Hebrew of the Hebrew. He says concerning the Torah, he was blameless because he was an observer of the Torah and a teacher of the Torah. And here we see that when he comes into town, he does not get the whole city to show up on the first day of the week. No, it doesn't even say that on that Sabbath, when they begged to hear those words, the Gentiles didn't say, hey, we want to hear these words tomorrow on the first day of the week. Let's have Sunday school. No, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. We see that they were keeping the Sabbath, and that when Shaul comes to town, he inspires almost all of the city to keep the Sabbath. Now, those who claim to follow Shaul, when they come into town, they build their enormous monuments with their steeples on top and all these things. They try to get the entire city to keep Sunday, the first day. This was not true in the first century, but the true believers of Yahushua. Let's see, if we go to Acts chapter 15 and verse 19. There is a situation that has come about because many Pharisees have come to believe in Yahushua, and they're confused. They don't know what they should do about the Gentiles, the other nations who are coming into belief of Yahushua. They think that perhaps we should go ahead and circumcise them. But let's look at the ruling in Acts 15 verse 19. It says, therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles, the nations, who are turning to Elohim, but that we write to them to abstain from defilements of idols. Now, if you've ever studied the Torah, you will know that the Torah gives a long list of defilements of idols. So just by observing this first commandment, you are keeping a great portion of Torah. And it says, and from whoring. Now, how do we define whoring? Everybody has their own opinion on adultery, but Yahuwah has the information that was given through his Torah that tells us in Leviticus what whoring is. He gave that to us so that we knew what was right and wrong when it came to adultery. And again, there's a long list that if you are keeping that much, you're keeping a huge portion of Torah. So it's not just 2 commands here. It's really, there's many compacted, into these commandments. And it says, and from what is strangled, and from defilements of blood. In verse 21, this is the most important part. It says, for from ancient generations. Now, by saying for, he is saying literally because. Because in ancient generations, Moshe has in every city those proclaiming him. So this is why he's saying this. And it says, being read in the congregations every Shabbat. So he's saying that the reason that we're going to give the Gentiles this small amount of things to observe first is because in every city, Moshe has those proclaiming them on the Sabbath. So in other words, the Gentiles were being required to go and learn the books of the Torah in the congregations on the Sabbath day. And this was the reason why they were able to start out with such a basic amount of commandments, from the defilements of idols and from whoring and from those things that were strangled and from blood. Because in ancient times, Moshe always has in every city those who are preaching from the Torah, teaching on the Sabbath day. They are to keep the Sabbath day and learn the words of Moshe. Very important to understand this properly. Most of the time when people read this verse, they just skip right over what was being said there. And they don't acknowledge it at all. In Acts 17, verse 2, it says, and according to his practice. Earlier we read about Yahushua's practice. Now we're going to read about Shaul's practice. It says, and according to his practice, Shaul. This is the same man, again, that they call Paul. It says, Shaul went unto them, and for 3 Sabbaths was reasoning with them from the Scriptures, explaining and pointing out that Mashiach, the Messiah, had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this is the Messiah Yahushua, whom I proclaim to you. And some of them did believe, and a large number of the worshiping Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Shaul and Silas. It is amazing. The Greeks, again, they're here on the Sabbath day, and they're hearing him preach about Yahushua, and they believe on Yahushua on the Sabbath day. It's very important to understand this. Shaul is always promoting the idea of learning on the Sabbath. He could have chose any day if he wanted to, but he didn't. He chooses the Shabbat because it is his custom. It is his practice. Why is it his practice? Because he was raised keeping the Torah, but also because he's a taught one of Yahushua. And remember, it was Yahushua's practice to go into the congregation and to read from the Torah. And now Shaul is also doing this. And remember now, Yahushua had died many years ago at this point in the book of Acts. And the resurrection had already transpired, but yet Shaul is still keeping the Sabbath. He never stopped. You know, if it is true, if the Western ideology is correct, and the Torah and the Sabbath was nailed to the execution stake of Yahushua, if this is true, Shaul never got the memo. He never got the message. He didn't learn this from Yahushua's taught ones, and he didn't learn this from Yahushua. He never promoted the idea that the Shabbat had been done away with, ever. But rather, he himself observes it after the death and the resurrection. For those who try to say that the Shabbat's been done away with. You know, it's not been done away with. It's an everlasting law. We read that in the Torah. It's everlasting. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, it says, let no one therefore judge you in eating or in drinking or in respect of a festival or a new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of what is to come, but the body is of Mashiach. All right? Now that's what some versions say. The body is of Mashiach. But literally, there's no of there. It just says the body is Messiah. So you don't let anybody judge you but the body of Messiah, according to the way that you observe the Sabbath, according to the drinks that you have on the Shabbat, which, you know, the wine and the bread that we have on Shabbat, the Sabbath, and the meats that we eat, which are the clean meats. Now, if you want to see somebody judge someone, you try to keep Yahuwah's dietary laws. And you immediately see people who will be angry with you because you won't eat pig and you won't eat these various unclean animals. They will look down on you. But here we see we are not to let these people judge us. Let no one judge you. The only one who can judge you is the body of Messiah. Western Christianity understands this verse completely wrong. The way that they take this is they would say in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, it says, let no one therefore judge you in eating or in drinking. So in other words, nobody can judge what you eat or drink. You can eat anything unclean. Or in the respect of a festival. They take that to mean like their observance of Christmas or something. But this is where it gets strange. Or a new moon or Sabbath. Well, they don't keep the new moons or the Sabbath. So that's not what it's talking about. It's very clear. This is a complete mixed up understanding. What he's saying is that now that you Colossians observe the Sabbath and the festivals and the new moons, and you're eating kosher, you're eating clean, and you are partaking in the drinks, the wine on the Shabbat and these various things, let no one judge you. Because these things are a shadow of things to come, great things to come, he says. So keep that in mind. The Sabbath is a shadow, and all the festivals are a shadow of things to come. In the book of Ibrim or Hebrews, in chapter 4, we read in verse 9, it says, so therefore remains a rest, is what most translations say. However, in the Greek, the word is sabbatismo, And Sabbatismo literally means a Sabbath observance. In Aramaic, it's lema shabbata. Lema shabbata means literally the giving of Sabbath. So it means there remains a giving of Sabbath. There is a Sabbath to come, which is very important to the understanding of the fulfillment of the Shabbat. And the true reason the Shabbat was given was because of the Shabbat that is coming. Okay? So there remains a Sabbath keeping, a Sabbath observance, or a Sabbath giving for the people of Elohim. This is so much deeper than just there remains a rest. I mean, when people read this, they don't even realize that this has anything to do with Sabbath. But in the actual Greek and Aramaic, it has everything to do with keeping the Sabbath. For the one having entered into his rest has himself also rested from his works as Elohim rested from his own. Let us therefore do our utmost to enter into that rest, lest anyone fall after the same example of disobedience. For the word of Elohim is living and working and sharper than any two-edged sword, cutting through even to the dividing of being and spirit, or ruach, and joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Now the Christians like to read that verse. They'll say, the word of the L-O-R-D, which we know this is the word of Yahuwah, is stronger and sharper than any two-edged sword. They say that it cuts between the bones and marrow. They read these very verses, but in context you will never see them read it. Because in context it's saying that the Shabbat is the reason. Because there is a Sabbath to come. Because there is a Sabbath observance. That is why he says the word of Elohim is stronger and sharper than any two-edged sword. In proper context. Now, we need to look a little more at the character of Shaul himself. Because many people, again, have come to a great misunderstanding about the Brit Hadashah. And Shaul, after all, wrote a great deal of the Brit Hadashah. Let's look at this claim of whether or not Shaul was a Christian or not. Because the reality is, the word Christian was only used a couple of times in the scriptures, and it was always used by Greeks who were calling the true believers in Yahushua, who were Yahudim, calling them Christians, because the Greeks had many Christ in their religion. They had many Christos. Zeus was a Christos, and the Helios was a Christos. All these were seen as a Christos. So when they heard about a Messiah, they just attributed those same pagan connotations to the early believers of Yahushua. But in reality, in Acts chapter 24, verse 5, it says, for having found this man a plague, this is talking about Shaul, who stirs up dissension among all the Yahudim throughout the world, and a ringleader in the sect of the Nazarene, or the Nazarenes, as some versions might say, but the word is Nazarene in Hebrew, and Nazarene refers to an offshoot from a tree or a plant. When a tree sends out little baby trees, this is basically what it's talking about, an offshoot, a natsar. That word natsar also means a watchman. And Yahushua was called Yahushua HaNatsari because he was from a place called Nazareth, but also because he is the watchman, because he is the offshoot. And Shaul is now called a ringleader in the sect of the Nazarene, which are named after Yahushua. In Acts chapter 21, verse 20, it says, and when they heard it, they praised the master, and they said, you see, brother, how many thousands of Yahudim there are who have believed, and are all ardent for the Torah. They are all zealous for the Torah. This is important, again, because during this first century, Shaul was not the first Christian. You know, he was a Nazarene. He was an offshoot of Yahushua. He was teaching the people about the Hebrew Messiah, trying to bring them to the truth and reality of Yahuwah Elohim. And it says that there were thousands of Yahudim during this time period who kept the Torah, they were zealous for the Torah, and they believed in Yahushua. This is very contrary to the way that Christianity teaches. The way that Christianity teaches, you would think that all the Jews, the Yahudim, did not follow Yahushua. They forget that those first believers, those first taught ones and disciples were all Yahudim. They were not Greeks. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, we read how we've gotten to this point. We're 2,000 years removed from the life, death, and resurrection of Yahushua, and here we find ourselves in a very backwards world where those who say they know Him don't keep His commandments. It's very strange to those who may be new to this. They wonder, how did this happen? This is the answer. It says, let no one deceive you in any way, because the falling away is to come first, and the man of lawlessness is to be revealed, the son of destruction. In Western ideology and theology, they believe that this is a day that is coming. That in the future, this is how Christianity interprets this verse. In the future, many Christians will fall away from their Christianity, and then the man of lawlessness, which is synonymous with the anti-Messiah, will be revealed. But what Christianity does not understand is that in context, Shaul said that this falling away was already happening, that people were already twisting and turning the truths of Messiah at this time period. What they do not understand is the falling away has already happened. And here we are in the midst of this falling away, where those, again, who say they know Him have fallen away from Him. They do not observe His precepts. They do not keep His Torah. They do not do these things that please Him. The man of sin has already been revealed. We know who He is. We know His throne. We know His seat. We know His decrees. We know who He is. But Christianity waits for a day that is coming, and this is going to be a snare to them. They're already snared by the belief that they are to be lawless and not keep the Torah. But because of these things, because they look at everything in the Scriptures as if it hasn't happened yet, they are going to be further deceived. Now, let's look at a little bit about this falling away. If we were to fast forward past the time of Shaul and to the year 321, we will read about Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine was supposedly the first Roman emperor to become a Christian. Well, yeah, he became a Christian in the sense that he originally worshipped Mithra, who was an idol that was called a Christos. But he was not a true follower of Yahushua, obviously, because of all the pagan things that he did. And we read one of his laws. Listen to how sick this law is that he instated. It says, on the venerable day of the sun, that's Sunday, this is the first day of the week, let the magistrates and the people residing in cities rest. He's making Sunday the day of rest. This is where it comes from. It doesn't come from Scripture. You got to wake up. It comes from a Roman pagan king. It says, and let all the workshops be closed. In the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not suitable for grain sowing or for vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost. This is sick. He's saying that they should rest on the Sabbath. Unless you're a farmer, then you can still participate in your agriculture, because after all, they're worshiping the sun. They're worshiping the power of the sun to give their produce. They're not worshiping Yahuwah. Believe me. If we would fast forward, we read in the Council of Laodicea. It says, Christians should not Judaize. Oh, what? Judaize. Apparently Judaizing is anyone who keeps the Torah. So if you keep the Torah, you are a Judaizer. Christians should not Judaize and should not be idle on the Sabbath. That means, you have to understand something. You have to understand this. For this to have been made a law, Common sense should tell you that there were people during that time period who were being called Christians, possibly by others. Maybe they had begun to call themselves Christians even at this time because of their own ignorance of the truth. But you have to understand, for this to become a law that they cannot be idle or rest on the Sabbath day, they must have been resting on the Sabbath day, or else there would be no need for a law to tell them not to. Christians should not Judaize and should not be idle on the Sabbath, but should work on that day. They should, however, particularly reverence the Lord's Day. That's what they call it, the Lord's Day. That's Sunday. You know, for those of you who don't know, they have deemed Sunday the Lord's Day, referring to Yahushua, saying that the Master rose on the first day of the week. We have already proven that did not happen. He rose on the Sabbath. It says, and if possible, not work on it on the first day of the week, because they are Christians. Now see, what happened was the original believers, they were all Yahudim. They observed the Torah, they kept the Torah. But what happened was that years and years later, the Yahudim who kept the Torah and believed in Yahushua would be persecuted to such a degree that the Gentiles would split away. And instead of there being Yahudim that were teaching them the truths of Yahushua, now they were teaching themselves. And they were mixing and blending their former cultures and philosophies and religions in with the truth of Yahuwah. This is the great falling away that happened. Now I want to look at one example of a reference in history to the Nazarene. This was done by Epiphanes. This was centuries after Shaul's life, after Yahushua's life. It says, we shall now especially consider heretics who call themselves Nazarene. Now remember, this is interesting because Shaul, Paul, the man they call Paul, he was called a Nazarene. But now they're saying anyone who calls himself a Nazarene is a heretic. They are mainly Yahudim, or what they call Jews, and nothing else. They make use not only of the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, but they also use in a way what they call Old Testament of the Yahudim. For they do not forbid the books of the Torah. Now for them to say this, that means that these Gentile Christians had begun to forbid the books of the Torah, the books of Moshe. They did not forbid the books of the law, the prophets, and the writings, so that they are approved by the Yahudim, and whom the Nazarene do not differ in anything. And they profess all the dogmas pertaining to the prescriptions of the law, the Torah, and to the customs of the Yahudim, except they believe in Mashiach. They preach that there is but one Elohim, and his son Yahushua, the Messiah. But they are very learned in the Hebrew language, for they, like the Yahudim, read the whole Torah. Then the prophets. They differ from the Yahudim because they believe in the Messiah. And from the Christians in that they are to this day bound to the Yahudi rites, such as circumcision, the Sabbath, and other ceremonies. This is very interesting. We see that centuries later there are still Nazarene, and we see unfolding before us the truth and reality of the falling away. That the Gentiles had began to look down on the Yahudim for keeping the Torah, and they had segregated and separated themselves from the original followers of Yahushua. Now I want to look at an example of a prophecy Yahushua gave in Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, Yahushua said, speaking to his Talmudim, speaking to his taught ones, concerning the destruction of the house of Yahuwah that was coming. And he warned those who lived in Judea, which is Yehuda, that lived in Yehuda during this time period, that when they see the abomination of desolation setting where it should not, that they should flee, that they should run. And he specifically says to pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath day. And what is interesting is we know for a certainty that it was on the Sabbath day that Titus would destroy the house of Yahuwah and would come into Jerusalem and begin to destroy the people. Look at some historical records here. We're going to examine Josephus. Josephus recording the words of Agarthachides, who is a 2nd century historian. And it reads in Against Appian in 1209. It says, there are a people called Yahudim, they put Jews, and dwell in a city, the strongest of all other cities, which the inhabitants call Jerusalem, or Yerushalayim, and are accustomed to rest on every 7th day. Okay, this is kind of important because, again, we know that Yahudim, they don't just keep, every Sabbath day for a few Sabbaths and then they reset the count because of a new moon, which some people have tried to teach recently. And we know that they don't keep the same Sabbath for a whole year and then keep a different one the next year because of the equinox, which some people are trying to say that it, resets, and sometimes, you only have 6 days before you have to reset it, or 2 days and you got to reset your count. This is ridiculous. This comes from people who don't know Hebrew and don't truly know Yahuwah. I mean, the reality is they kept every 7th day, and the Torah told us this over and over and over, and now Josephus is emphasizing it through the words of a pagan historian. And it says that the Yahudim are accustomed to rest on every 7th day, on which times they make no use of their arms, nor meddle with husbandry, nor take care of any affairs of life, but spread out their hands in their Kodesh places, and pray till the evening. Now it came to pass that when Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, came into the city with his army, that these men, in observing this mad custom of theirs, again, this is a pagan saying this, instead of guarding the city, suffered their country to submit themselves to a bitter master, and their law was openly proven to have commanded a foolish practice. They are saying that they came into the city on the Sabbath because no one was guarding the city. They were not fighting on the Sabbath. Because they were observing the Sabbath, the pagans were allowed to come in. Now I want to look at a Roman soldier who wrote a book about Roman strategy, militant strategy. His name was Frontinius. And he says, the deified Augustus Vespasian attacked the Yahudim on the day of Saturn, a day on which it is sinful for them to do any business. Now during this time period, the Romans were keeping the Julian calendar. And on the Julian calendar, according to this man, the day that the Yahudim were keeping linked up, the Sabbath, the Shabbat, the true Shabbat, somehow linked up with the day, the Roman day of Saturn. Because, again, Saturn is actually the 7th classical planet. In Hebrew, we call it Shabbati. That's how we call that planet. Okay? Saturn is a pagan devil. It is the name of an idol. So we never use that term normally, unless I'm teaching and instructing, trying to share with people who have to hear these words to understand what we're saying. But it was on the day of Saturn, and he says this was the day that is sinful for the Yahudim to do any business. It was on this day that they were attacked because they were keeping the Sabbath. Remember, Yahushua said, pray that your flight not be on the Sabbath. Why did he say this? Because if your flight is on the Sabbath, you're not going to make it. On the Sabbath day is when they came. On the Sabbath day is when they destroyed. And Yahushua wept bitterly over this when he gave this prophecy. Now I want to look at another Roman soldier, Cassius Dio. And he writes, most of the city, to be sure, he took without any trouble, as he was received by the party of Hyrcanus. But the temple itself, which the other party had occupied, he captured only with difficulty. For it was on high ground and was fortified by a wall of its own. And if they had continued defending it all days alike, he could not have got possession of it. As it was, they made an excavation of what are called the days of Saturn. And by doing no work at all on those days, so the Yahudim were doing no work on the days that the Romans called Saturn during the 1st century, afforded the Romans an opportunity in this interval to batter down the wall. The latter, on learning of this superstitious awe of theirs, this is what the Roman is calling, and he's calling the Shabbat a superstition, made no serious attempts of rest of the time, but on those days when they came round in succession, assaulted most vigorously. Thus the defenders were captured on the day of Saturn without making any defense, and all the wealth was plundered. The kingdom was given to Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus was carried away. Now we'll look at another quote from Cassius Dio. He says, the Yahudim indeed had done much injury to the Romans, but they suffered far more themselves. The first of them to be captured were those who were fighting for the precinct of their Elohim, and then the rest on the day, even the day of Saturn. And so excessive were they in their devotion to religion that the first set of prisoners, those who had been captured along with the temple, obtained leave from Sosius when the day of Saturn came round again, and went up into the temple, and they performed all their customary rites together with the rest of the people. Those people Antony entrusted to a certain Herod, this is King Herod, to govern. By Antigonus he bound to a cross and flogged, a punishment no other king had suffered at the hands of the Romans, and afterwards slew him. Now here's another quote by Cassius Dio. It says, thus was Jerusalem destroyed on the very day of Saturn, the day of which even now the Yahudim reverence most. Now remember, this is during the first century. Yahushua kept the same Sabbath that the rest of the nation of the Yahudim kept. He kept the same Sabbath. We saw earlier that he was breaking bread in the Pharisees' house on the Sabbath day, that he heals on the Sabbath day, that he's teaching in the congregation on the Sabbath day. There is no controversy in the first century what day the Sabbath is. Absolutely none. Everyone knows. Josephus Flavius, a great historian, writes about the Pharisees, the Sadducees. He also talks about the Essenes and a few other sects. And he never once references that any of these sects kept a different Sabbath, but in fact references that they all kept the same Sabbath. And we know that this is true when we look at history. When we look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, we will see that the Pharisees and the oral traditions, that they argued and they had so many different opinions on so many different things. But in regards to the keeping of the Sabbath day and when it was, there was never an argument. None of the Yahudim over the entire span of the globe disagree on the Sabbath day. They disagree on many things, but not on which day the Sabbath day is. It does not matter where they are found, whether they be found in Russia or whether they be found in Africa, whether they be found in Asia or North America. It does not matter. They keep the same Sabbath that was being kept in the first century. We know that Ethiopia has a calendar that keeps a record of 2,000-year-old cycle of Sabbaths from the first century. It's very important to understand. Yahushua would have kept the true Sabbath. So therefore, we don't have to go back in time 6,000 years to find out what day the Sabbath is. We only have to go back 2,000 years. And we see that on all sides of the spectrum, the day that was the day of the Sabbath is still being kept on the same day. Because when the Julian calendar went to the Gregorian calendar, there was not a weekday lost. Not one day was lost. The same 7-day cycle that the Romans used for the Julian calendar, they used for the Gregorian pagan calendar. It's a pagan calendar. But on their 7-day cycle, it correlates with our 7-day cycle. Not exactly, however, because in Roman times, a day starts at midnight. In our time, it starts in the evening. From the evening of the Roman Friday, which is a pagan day. It's named after a pagan goddess. We don't like to use these terminologies, but only so that you understand what I'm saying. From the evening of the 6th day, which the Romans call Friday, to the evening of the 7th day, which the Romans call the day of Saturn. Historically, we know that this is true. There is no doubt about it whatsoever. Now, Earlier, we talked about the Shabbat and the festivals being a shadow of things to come. So finally, we are going to wrap up this study on the Shabbat with the most beautiful prophecy, I believe, in the entirety of Scripture, and it refers to the Shabbat. Let us go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, it reads, I came to be in the Ruach, or the Spirit, on the day of YaHuWaH, on the Yom of YaHuWaH. And I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet. Now in Christianity, because they have gone through the falling away and they have been filtered out from Yahuwah's people, they have a false understanding for the most part of what this day of YaHuWaH is. They believe, because they call it the day of the Lord in their translations, they believe this is the venerable day of the Sunday, the first day. You remember the day that Constantine had set apart and made to be an religious observance, but that same day not being found, observed by any of Yahushua's taught ones? Yeah, you see, if we were to look here in the Aramaic, however, we see something amazing. We actually see that this is called the Sabbath. But what is interesting is in the Greek, it is called the day of YaHuWaH. The day of YaHuWaH. And both are equally important. You see, the day of YaHuWaH is a reference that the prophets speak about often. They often say that the day of YaHuWaH is coming. It is a day of darkness. That there's going to be fire. There's going to be judgment. This is essentially what people call the apocalypse, or the end of time. Now, the word apocalypse just means the unveiling. But we know that this is what people think of, especially when you think about the book of Revelation. And doesn't it make sense that Yahuchanan, who's John, he says he's caught up into the Ruach on the day of YaHuWaH, and now he begins to see prophetic events about the day of YaHuWaH. So it's really talking about the day of YaHuWaH of the prophets. But in Aramaic, there's a correlation with the day of YaHuWaH and the Sabbath. And this is beautiful, because if we go over to Psalm chapter 90. Let's go to Psalm chapter 90. And we're going to bring complete clarity to this prophetic revelation of the Sabbath. In Tehillim, Psalm chapter 90, verse 4, says, For 1,000 years in your eyes are like yesterday that has passed. For 1,000 years is as yesterday that has passed. 1,000 years in the eyes of YaHuWaH is as a day. Let's go to 2 Kippah, which has been called Peter. 2 Kippah. And in 2 Kippah, chapter 3, we're going to read in verse 8. It says, But beloved ones, let not this one matter be hidden from you, that with YaHuWaH 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as 1 day. This is so important. Stay with me. Now we're going to go to Revelation chapter 20, and I'm going to bring about a full circle here for you to understand and connect all these dots. But we correlating the day of YaHuWaH with 1,000 years. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 1, And I saw a messenger, a malach, coming down from the Shamayim, having the key to the pit and a great chain in his hand. And he seized the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Shaitan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Remember, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. And he threw him into the pit of the deep and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should lead the nations no more astray until the 1,000 years were ended. And after this he has to be released for a little while. And I saw thrones, and they that sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And the lives of those who had been beheaded because of the witness of Yahushua, and because of the word of Elohim, and who did not worship the beast nor his image, and did not receive his mark upon their foreheads or upon their hands. And they lived and reigned with Mashiach for 1,000 years. And the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. Baruch and Kodesh is the one having part in the first resurrection. The second death possesses no authority over these. But they shall be Kohanim, or priests, of Yahuwah and of Messiah, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years have been ended, Shaitan shall be released from prison, and he shall go out to lead the nations astray, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog. This is mentioned in Ezekiel 38, verse 2. To gather them together for battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. And they came up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the Kodesh ones and the beloved city. And fire came down from Elohim out of the Shemayim and consumed them. And the devil who had led them astray was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophets are. And they shall be tortured day and night forever and ever. Remember, they have no rest, day or night. This is so beautiful, because if we know the understanding of the land Sabbaths, that every 7 years there's a Sabbath, just like every 7 days there's a Sabbath, and we know that a day is as 1,000 years, then we can pull about a great revelation by understanding that if we were to do a study on man and the time frame of the lifespan of man, and look at when Adam was made, it was 6,000 years ago. We are now entering into the 7,000th year, which is a Sabbath, a millennial Shabbat. And we see that Yahushua will rule and reign for 1,000 years, for one day, for the Sabbath day, for 1,000 years, literally, but Yahuwah's eyes is at one day. And he's going to rule after that, because the scriptures, the prophets say that he will rule forever and ever. We know that the prophets have spoken clearly about the age of the Messiah and the millennial Shabbat, saying that in that time, the lion and the lamb shall dwell together and lie down together. There will be no war, and there will be no fighting in all of Yahuwah's Kodesh mountain. There will be shalom. And on the seventh day, when we proclaim the Shabbat, we say Shabbat Shalom, which means Shabbat peace. This is the revelation of what is coming. Yahushua is going to rule and reign as the sovereign of Yahuwah during the millennial Shabbat, which is coming. He's going to rule and reign with those who had been beheaded for his testimony, and those who followed him. They are going to be resurrected, and they are going to rule on the earth for 1,000 years. Shaitan will be bound. He will not be loosed. There will be shalom. There will be true peace like the world has never known. And then after this, he will be loosed for just a little bit, and then he will be destroyed. But this is important to understand, that the Shabbat, the true picture of Shabbat, is for the world that is to come, and it's to proclaim the Messiah. You cannot take the Messiah away from the Sabbath. He is the Shabbat. He is the master of the Shabbat. He is going to come and rule and reign for an entire millennial Shabbat. And we proclaim the day of Yahuwah. The day of Yahuwah. It's not just one day. When we read, there's so many things that happen. There's darkness, there's cloud, there's fire, there's pillar of smoke, there's all these things. But just as a day begins in the evening, as it begins to be the darkest point, as the day is waning and the night is coming, we see that the day of Yahuwah, it says, is a day of darkness. It begins in darkness, just like the weekly Sabbath. But through this darkness is birthed the millennial reign of the Messiah, where the lion and the lamb will lie down together, and there will be true shalom. Now let's look at Yeshayahu, Isaiah, chapter 55, just the first few verses. We're about to wrap up this study. In verse 1 it says, "O everyone who thirsts, come to the waters." Remember, Yahushua cried out with a loud voice, and he said, "Everyone who thirsts, let him come to me. And out of his innermost being will come forth rivers of living water." And here it says, "O everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you who have no silver, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without silver and without price. Why do you weigh out silver for what is not bread, and you labor for what does not satisfy. Listen to me and eat what is told, and let your being delight itself in fatness. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear so that your being lives, and let me make an everlasting covenant with you, the trustworthy, loving commitments of David. See, I have given him, this is Messiah, as a witness to the people, a leader and a commander for the people. See, a nation you do not know, you shall call, and a nation who does not know you run to you, because of YaHuWaH your Elohim and the Kodesh one of Yasharel. For he has adorned you. Seek YaHuWaH while he's to be found. Call on him while he's near. This is talking about when YaHuWaH sets up his Messiah. And it says, come everyone who thirsts. Why do you buy? Why do you spend money on food? Why do you do these things? Come and eat without price. In the millennial reign, we will have all that we need. Remember, Yahushua fed thousands upon thousands multiple times with just a few loaves and a few fish, showing that he could sustain the entire nation by YaHuWaH Elohim in his life. And here we see that when we are with the Messiah, we will have no need for mammon, no need for money, no need for silver and gold. But rather, he will provide our every need. He will give us our substance. He will give us what we're to have. This is why we don't buy and sell on the Sabbath. Because the weekly Sabbath is a picture of the millennial Sabbath. This is why we don't work on the Sabbath. Because it is a picture, a shadow, as Shaul said in Colossians, a shadow of things to come. And this is why, my brothers and my sisters, it is so important that you keep the Sabbath, the true Sabbath. There are many proposing false doctrines about the Sabbath. There is a war that is being waged trying to keep you from observing the Shabbat. There are teachers who are saying, don't keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath's not important. We don't know when it is, or we think we know what it is, and it's not when everybody else is keeping it. We've got this other way of figuring it out. Brothers and sisters, you cannot buy into this flavor of the month teaching, because it's here today, it's gone tomorrow. But forever and ever and ever the precept of YaHuWaH shall remain. The Sabbath shall remain. My heart longs for that day when YaHuWaH sets him up, the Messiah, as the commander of the people. That day when we come, all who are thirsty, and drink from the living waters. That day when those who are hungry do not have to pay for their food. They are sustained by the word of YaHuWaH, the Debar YaHuWaH. My being and my heart longs for this time. And brothers and sisters, it is my prayer that you will enter into his rest. That you will enter into the rest that was promised in the book of Hebrews. That you will enter into the rest that YaHuWaH promised in the Torah. And please remember, it was YaHuWaH who first kept the Sabbath. It is him who made it Kodesh. He made it a sign for you to wear. You are to be his people and to guard his commandments. And you have to observe the true Shabbat. It is a necessity. It is of the utmost importance to restore an observing of the Shabbat throughout the people of this world, because the Messiah is the Shabbat. Remember, he said, come unto me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The master of Shabbat will give you the Shabbat. He will give you the rest. He will give you rejuvenation in your life. He will heal you. He will strengthen you. YaHuWaH will barak you for keeping the Shabbat. There are barakot that are recorded in the Torah if you will keep his Shabbat, if you will choose what he chooses, if you will delight yourself in YaHuWaH Elohim and his Sabbaths. I pray that you will enter into the Shabbat of the world that is to come, and that great millennial Sabbath that is coming, when Yahushua shall rule and reign. Hallelujah. Shalom to you. Shalom, shalom.
Today.